Well, welcome everybody. This should be our annual dinner, but of course nothing's normal at the moment. What we do have, however, is a distinguished speaker, Judge Bradbury, and so without much further ado, we all know why we're here, to hear about the unknown warrior. I'm looking forward to it very much. Some of you may have seen what do we call the commemorative activities today. Charles and Camilla were leading it really, and everybody was wearing masks and sitting well apart. But it was very dignified, and these are always very moving occasions. And even in these straitened circumstances, I think we all feel moved and connected to the story of the unknown warrior. So, as I say, without further ado, I'm going to ask His Honour Charles Welchman, another retired judge, to introduce Judge Bradbury. Charles, over to you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. It's a real pleasure to introduce the club and for this evening's event, my very learned and charming friend, His Honour Anthony Bradbury. The only disappointment really is that he and his charming wife, Rosemary, are not able to join us for dinner, because I'm sure not only will you enjoy the talk, but you would enjoy their company as well. And we'll have to put that right. I'll try and put that right in the not too distant future. Judge Bradbury has had a very distinguished career. He was the principal of a respected firm of solicitors in Wandsworth called Bradbury's, appropriately enough. He was a member of the GLC and also ILIA, and he has a distinction that he shares with a good many members of this club, in that he didn't get himself elected to Parliament. I can say that, in fact, he didn't distinguish himself as well as some of ours, because he would not be entitled to sing Losing Deposits to the tune of Waltzing Matilda, which, as some of you may know, is one of the songs that's sung at Liberal gatherings when old candidates get together and reminisce about past days. But that's a little bit of fun, but for another occasion. Now, 50 years ago, well, I suppose 50 years ago is quite a long time ago. We're talking about something that's now 100 years ago today for this event. But 50 years ago, it wasn't possible for a solicitor, a practicing solicitor, to do more than get his foot on the first rung of the judicial ladder. All further routes upwards were barred. And it's taken a little time to get through that. But Tony is one of the people who has made his way against, I think, fairly heavy sea, and I think in different circumstances he would have been even more distinguished and more successful than he's been. But he made his way up the judicial tree, starting in the county court with what was then a registrar, now a district judge civil. He then became a recorder, and from there he became a circuit judge, sitting in both the Crown Court and the county court, and towards the end of his career was sitting in all three divisions of the High Court, and with a great deal of distinction. He was a top judge and a good judge too, doing that, and very widely respected member of the judiciary, and I say a very comprehensive career. I mean, really, he covered pretty well every angle of the law in the course of his life on the bench. And I dare say, as a solicitor in Wandsworth, no doubt he had to cover pretty wide areas as well. The other thing that Tony is very good at is historical research, and he really does that with great distinction. And it is a great delight today to invite him to tell us about the burial of the unknown warrior, who was buried, as you know, 100 years ago today. Over to Judge Bradbury to tell us about that very significant event.
Well, good evening again to you all. I hope that my voice will be loud enough for you to glean the gist of what I'm going to say. But today, as you know, at 11 o'clock in Westminster Abbey, there was a somber but beautifully crafted ceremony to commemorate the 100th anniversary of the burial of the unknown warrior in that famous grave close to the west doors. And 100 years ago, whereas there were only 80 people in the Abbey this morning, there were over 1,000 people present, nearly all women, most of whom had either lost their husband in the war, or a son, or more than one son, and in some cases, a husband and several sons. As you might imagine, it was the most emotional form of service that can possibly be conceived. It was well prepared and attended by these ladies who had suffered such great loss in the Great War. And it all arose because of the thoughts of a young curate from the Church of England called David Railton, who was in 1914 a curate in the coastal town of Folkestone. He was then aged 30, and he decided it was his duty to join the army chaplaincy, which he did in 1915, and by early 1916 he was serving in France and in Belgium. He carried with him a flag. Those of you who watched the television this morning will have seen that flag carried from the Great West Door to the high altar in Westminster Abbey. And he used his flag at burial services, and there were hundreds of them taking place throughout the 3 years in which David Railton was a chaplain. And he used his flag also on Sunday services as an altarpiece for those occasions which gave many of the men respite and comfort. One day in January 1916, David Railton came back to his billet at Armentières near Albert in northern France. And he saw, buried in a small public garden next to the place in which he was living, a newly dug grave. And on that grave was a white cross. It was made of 2 pieces of white wood tied together by cord, and the words written on it in a black pencil were "An unknown soldier of the Black Watch." David Railton, who had ancestors who came from Scotland, knew at that moment of time that there would be relatives of this man, parents, no doubt at all, living perhaps still in Scotland, who would not yet be aware of their son's death, and perhaps a young widow and children who would learn shortly perhaps of the death of a husband and father, and who would never know where that relation of theirs, that very closest of relations, died and how he died in France or in Belgium or wherever else the Black Watch at that time were fighting. So Mr. Railton decided that when the war ended, he would approach someone in authority in London and ask that a body be exhumed from the battlefields of France and Flanders and brought back to London and buried in a prominent place, possibly at Westminster Abbey, to be a point at which all those who had lost their sons, their husbands, could come and remember him and believe perhaps that the man in such a grave was their own closest of relatives. That was David Railton's dream. He did nothing about it until after the war had ended, when he returned to Kent to become the vicar of Margate. He discussed his idea with his wife on a number of occasions, but was uncertain as to whom to write. And in 1919, there were some other events of significance. After the signing of the Treaty of Versailles, the government arranged a great peace march through London along the north and south banks of the River Thames and passing along Whitehall to go past a temporary cenotaph designed by Britain's wonderful architect, Sir Edwin Lutyens. And that cenotaph, which bears the inscription today and then of the glorious dead, was a pilgrim place for many who had lost their relatives in the Great War. It was intended that it be pulled down after the peace march, but public pressure prevailed upon the government, who decided that in 1920 there should be a permanent structure erected in Whitehall, also to be known as a cenotaph, to be a permanent reminder of the dead whose names were known or unknown and the places where they died, known or unknown, to which their families and the armed forces of Britain could attend. And before all that was arranged, there was to be the first of the many 2-minute silences announced by King George V to take place on Armistice Day 1919. And you will know that that great silence was universally welcomed and observed throughout the whole kingdom of Great Britain and Ireland. And so we come to 1920. David Railton knows that in 1920, this is really his last chance to suggest to someone that a body be returned to Britain. And he decided to write to the Dean of Westminster, the Right Reverend Herbert Royal. And he wrote to him on the 15th of August, 1920. The letter does not survive. It is not in the Westminster Abbey muniments. It is not held by members of the royal family. But David Railton subsequently said that he suggested to the Dean that it would be a great comfort to all the peoples of this country, and not least to those who had served in the armed forces, if a body of a man whose name was not known, whose regiment or unit was not known, whose rank was not known, could be exhumed and brought back to England for the very purposes that I have just described. And he said also that he would be glad if his padre's flag, that he'd used so often in battlefield burials, could be used in any service that was held in Westminster Abbey. The Dean replied promptly in mid-August and said he rather liked the idea, but he would like to reflect upon it for a while to see if it was practical. And he would tell David Railton later the result of his reflections. In fact, Dean Ryle did nothing until the 4th of October, 1920. When he went to see the Chief of the Imperial General Staff, Field Marshal Sir Henry Wilson. Sir Henry Wilson was a most imposing man, 6 foot, 6 inches tall, well respected in the army and the other armed forces. And he said at once to the Dean that he liked the idea, it should be put into practice, and the right time to have such a burial would be immediately after the unveiling by the King of the new cenotaph on Wednesday, the 11th of November, 1920. But the Field Marshal said, you will need the King's permission to go ahead with such a service and event as this. And so on the same day, the 4th of October, 1920, Herbert Ryle wrote to Lord Stamfordham, who was the King's permanent secretary and who'd been in royal service for a number of decades. And he put the proposition to him that I have already described and asked Lord Stamfordham to seek the King's permission for this commemoration and burial to take place. Lord Stamfordham said he would write to the King immediately, which he did. In those days, the postal service was quite efficient. The King was at Balmoral, and a reply came back 2 days later, in which the King said that he was not enthusiastic about this idea, that he thought it would inflame past tensions and anxieties, raise again new emotions, cause distress, and that 2 years after the end of the war, it was too late for such a burial, and that the cenotaph, to be unveiled by him on the 11th of November, would be a more appropriate place, to be regarded in a sense as a form of burial place, although, of course, it is an empty tomb for those who died in the Great War. So this was disappointing news, but Herbert Ryle was made of strong stuff, and he approached the Archbishop of Canterbury, Randall Davidson, who was keen for some religious element to be attached to the unveiling of the cenotaph, and he went back to Lord Stamfordham. The King, in a postscript to his initial letter to Lord Stamfordham, said that perhaps the Dean of Westminster Abbey should seek the views of the Prime Minister, who all here will know was David Lloyd George. And so the Prime Minister was approached, and the Prime Minister decided that this was an idea worth pursuing and said he would raise it with the Cabinet on the next available Cabinet day, which now, a few days after all this flow of correspondence had taken place, was to be on the 15th of October, 1920, just under a month from the day when the cenotaph was to be unveiled. Lloyd George, thinking, I believe, that he would have no difficulty, put his proposition to the Cabinet, and they rejected it. They said that they too believed the cenotaph should be the only national memorial. There were two minor members of the Cabinet, the President of the Board of Trade, Sir Robert Horne, and the Minister of Agriculture, Mr. Arthur Williams, who supported Lloyd George, and you might think that that would be the end of the matter. But Lloyd George had made one calculation, that there might be a loss, and so he needed a backup for his idea. And the doors to the Cabinet room were opened, and in marched Field Marshal Sir Henry Wilson, all 6 foot 6 inches of him, in full uniform and ready to address the Cabinet, which he duly did. And he told the Cabinet that nothing would give the men of the armed forces, the Army, the Royal Navy, the fledgling Air Force, more satisfaction and comfort than to know that one of their number, who had died in their cause and for king and country, would be brought back to this country and buried in a great ceremony in the Abbey. Well, having heard the Field Marshal, the Cabinet unanimously agreed. And so the King was told on the 16th of October, and magnanimously, because he was a constitutional monarch, wrote again to his private secretary, saying he would concur with the idea. He knew David Lloyd George would support it, and he wouldn't oppose it anymore, and he would be happy for the burial to take place after the unveiling of the cenotaph. So, that decision having been made, it was now necessary for practical arrangements to be made. And in the best army traditions, the line of command was passed down by the Field Marshal to the Adjutant General, General Sir George Macdonogh, and then to Brigadier General Louis Wyatt, who was the commanding officer of troops in France and Flanders, and who happily also happened to be a director of the War Graves Commission. Brigadier General Wyatt was based at a barracks called St. Paul, which is about 20 miles south of Boulogne. And he instructed that 3 working parties, consisting each of a captain and 2 men, should be sent to 4 of the great battlefields of the Great War. And the 4 battlefields selected were at Arras, at Ypres, the Aisne, and Somme. We know all this because General Wyatt wrote a letter 20 years later to the Daily Telegraph in which he set out his instructions. But his instructions were never put in writing. You will not find a file in the old War Office, in the Ministry of Defence, or in the National Archives, which deal with these practical arrangements for finding and sending home an unknown warrior. And that is part of the mystique and mystery, because it is so important that no one can ever ascertain from where a body was chosen and who that man was, where he came from in the United Kingdom, his background, his family, his future hopes. The whole purpose of an unknown warrior is that he could be identified with every single man who died in France and Flanders and throughout the world, and whose body was never found, and so that the families of each and every one of them could identify with the warrior to be brought home from France. So these parties of 3 men apiece went out on the battlefields, and on the 8th of November 1920, they brought back to St. Paul 4 bodies. They came at different times from different directions. They took their burdens. These were grievous burdens for these men to bring back. They took them into a temporary chapel at St. Paul, and they left at different times and went their different ways. Each body was placed on a stretcher and covered by a Union flag. And at midnight that night, that is the 8th/9th November 1920, the Brigadier General, accompanied by one of his staff officers, Lieutenant Colonel Gell, went back into the small chapel, just the 2 of them there. The Brigadier General placed a hand on the Union flag lying across one of the stretchers, and so the unknown warrior was chosen. And the Brigadier General and Lieutenant Colonel picked up that body and between them placed it in a small, simple pine coffin that was resting there, and they picked up the lid and they screwed it down. Not normally jobs to be done by Brigadier Generals, but done by them on that occasion. And in the next morning, the 3 remaining bodies were taken out by other troops and they were reburied. There is some doubt as to where they were buried. One officer, who became a Major General later, wrote in 1958 that he had responsibility for putting these further 3 bodies in a shell hole on the road to Albert, from where he would know they would be discovered by parties of other soldiers looking for the dead, to be buried in the new Imperial War Grave cemeteries. But very recently, a piece of paper has come to hand, being a written order to a captain to take 3 bodies to a civilian cemetery near to St. Paul and bury them there, but without any markers being placed upon the grave. So we do not know where those other three men, any one of whom could have been selected as the unknown warrior, now lies. We go back to the 9th of November. This was all, of course, taking place on French soil. So the French army were very keen to be much involved, not in the selection of the warrior, but in the conveyance of him with due respect, reverence, and dignity to the port of Boulogne. And he was taken in a French army wagon the 20 miles to Boulogne, there to rest in the great chateau or castle at Boulogne, which is about a mile from the harbour. And overnight he was placed in the library, scattered with autumnal leaves. And 4 soldiers, French poilus, guarded the library as the unknown warrior was laid to rest. And first thing in the morning on the 10th of November 1920, another coffin was brought into that room. It was brought from England. It was a coffin hewed from an oak tree on the King's Hampton Court estate. It is said that the edges of the coffin are all 2 inches in width. And with it came a ceremonial sword chosen by King George V from the great collection held in his name at the Tower of London. And so the little pine coffin was placed within this grand oak coffin, and the lid of that sealed down and bound with steel straps, and the ceremonial sword placed between them. Marshal Foch and General Weygand had come from Paris to Boulogne to pay their respects, and they met there the Adjutant General Sir George Macdonogh, who'd come from London. And the body was now placed on another French burial cart, followed by 600 French soldiers, but taken the mile or so to the port of Boulogne, along streets which were lined with French people. And at the port of Boulogne was a British destroyer, HMS Verdun. Verdun had been very carefully chosen by the naval staff in the Admiralty to bring this body back to Dover, because Verdun, of course, was the scene of the great French-German battle, in which so many French and German people died, and so many French soldiers were so seriously wounded. And so in sending the Verdun to Boulogne, the British government was paying its respects to the French service personnel. At 12 o'clock, there was a short service on the quayside, and the Verdun started to steam towards the centre of the English Channel. It was joined by 6 destroyers, 3 at the bow and 3 at the stern, and there were French warships also that accompanied this convoy of precious vehicles to the centre of the channel. They slowed and went their way across very quiet seas until shortly before reaching the port of Dover, there was heard a 19-gun field marshal salute coming from the battlements of Dover Castle. There were 3 regiments at that time based in Dover: the Royal West Kent Regiment, the Connaught Rangers, and the Royal Irish Fusiliers. And men from those 3 regiments were to be on the Admiralty Quay at Dover Harbour when the body of the unknown warrior was taken by naval men ashore to be escorted, this time by 6 colonels, to the Dover Marine Railway Station. And at that station was a special carriage which was to be used to take the body back to London. This carriage had been used to take back the remains of Edith Cavell, the English nurse who'd been executed by the Germans in 1915 for helping British soldiers to escape from foreign soil back home. Within the walls of the carriage, there were purple drapes. The roof was painted white. The train was due to leave Dover Marine and did leave Dover Marine at 5:50 p.m. that night. It steamed at a very slow pace through the Kent countryside. Where there were level crossings, it briefly paused. There were groups of women and children, wondering as all other people in the nation wondered, whether the man who was passing in that carriage before him was their closest and dearest relative. There were short stops at Faversham and at Gillingham and at Chatham, and it was 8:20 p.m. when this train with its most precious load arrived at Victoria Station. Here a little bit of manoeuvring took place because the train had travelled on lines belonging to the London and Chatham Railway. But the London and Brighton Railway, who had a stake in Victoria Station, wanted their say in these arrangements. And so the carriage was unhooked from the rear of the train, and a London and Brighton steam engine made the short journey from the sidings outside Victoria Station to platform 8, where the carriage was to be guarded by the Grenadier Guards overnight. And if you go to platform 8 today, you will find there a plaque put up by the Western Front Association about 20 years ago, in which the statement is made that here rested the unknown warrior on his last night in Britain before his burial in the Abbey. The next morning, Wednesday, like today, Wednesday, the 11th of November, 1920, 35,000 troops lined the streets of London in a processional route that was to take the unknown warrior through Grosvenor Gardens and up Hyde Park, down Constitution Hill, round the Queen Victoria Memorial, up the Mall, through Admiralty Arch, newly built in 1912, into Trafalgar Square, and down Whitehall to the Cenotaph, where it was due to arrive just before 11 a.m. I've mentioned the 35,000 troops, but there were there as well several 100,000 people who'd come from all over the nation, many of whom had never been to London before, and who came with the same belief as those women and children who'd stood by the level crossings in Kent, and retained that belief throughout their own long lives, that the man in the coffin to be buried in our great abbey was indeed their parent, their husband, or their son. The music played by the massed bands as this cortege slowly moved through the streets of London was of course muffled by the drums. The music included the Dead March in Saul. And as 50,000 people crammed into Trafalgar Square, they heard Scottish pipers piping away that great lament, the flowers of the forest. There could have been in the long history of our capital no more poignant moment than that. These hundreds of thousands of people participating in the most important funeral in which they would participate in all their lives. By now, the pallbearers had become field marshals and admirals. They included Lord Hague, Viscount French, who, as Sir John French, had led the expeditionary force into France in 1914, Earl Beatty, General Gratliff in charge of the Royal Marines, and Air Marshal Trenchard from the rather fledgling Royal Air Force. They marched alongside the coffin until they reached the cenotaph at 1 minute to 11 o'clock. King George V was waiting for them. He was handed a wreath by Field Marshal Haig, and with a card in his own writing, he placed it on top of the coffin in the gun carriage now drawn across the road, the 6 black horses waiting quietly for their next few movements ahead. But Big Ben struck at 11 o'clock. The 2-minute silence took place, and as Reveille was sounded, great Union flags surrounding the cenotaph were pulled down, and the king and his family and his ministers saw the beautiful white stone of the cenotaph. And now the coffin of the unknown warrior had to take its final journey, drawn by those black horses, to Westminster Abbey. 4 queens had stood on the balcony in Whitehall, the old Home Office balcony overlooking the cenotaph. They were Queen Mary, the spouse of George V, Queen Alexandra, the widow of Edward VII, the Queen of Norway, and the Queen of Spain, and they were taken by car to the Abbey, whilst the cortege moved on, with the king leading behind the coffin, marching alone, but followed then by 3 of his sons, Edward, later to be Edward VIII, Albert, later to be George VI, and Prince Henry, later to be Duke of Gloucester. And they were joined by the elderly Duke of Connaught from the Victorian era. And behind them came the 2 men who'd been prime ministers in the Great War, Mr. Asquith and Mr. Lloyd George. And behind them came all those who'd served in cabinets throughout the whole period of the war, and the military chiefs of staff. There had been a service in progress in the Abbey since 11 o'clock. That service, in front of all those ladies that I've already mentioned, was drawing to its close when the cortege reached the north doors of the Abbey, and the body was carried down the nave to the great west doors, carried between 96 men, 74 of whom were wearing the ribbon and the medal of the Victoria Cross, and the other 22 wearing other medals of gallantry. This was the most poignant moment that might be imagined. The funeral music included "I Am the Resurrection and the Light" by Crofton Purcell, and Beethoven's Equale for trombones was played. Then the words of the 23rd Psalm, "The Lord is my shepherd," was sung. Hymns, "Lead, Kindly Light," "Abide with Me," and Kipling's Recessional were heard throughout the walls of the great Abbey. And as the body was lowered into the grave that had been dug for it, it rested on soil that had been brought just the day before from the battlefields of France and Flanders. And King George V, holding a silver trowel, sprinkled further soil from France over the coffin as it rested before him. And so this extraordinary service came to an end, and the king and his chiefs of staff and his ministers left the Abbey to the sounds of the grand solemn march by G.J. Miller, and then, of course, the national anthem. The Dean of Westminster Abbey having just previously intoned the the famous words of ashes to ashes, dust to dust. That may have ended the formal burial ceremony of the unknown warrior, but there was much more to follow. Tonight, at 6 o'clock, the Abbey floor is empty. No one is near the burial place of the unknown warrior, but 100 years ago, at 6 o'clock, those 1,000 widows and mothers of sons who had been lost in the war moved forward themselves to pass this grave in silent reflection. And there were thousands more waiting outside, hoping to pay their homage that evening and in the days beyond. They included a great queue of people waiting from Westminster Bridge, down the embankment, past close to your club, the National Liberal Club, and down to Blackfriars. Another club was in Whitehall. Another queue was in Whitehall. Another queue was in Victoria Street. And another queue was waiting patiently all the way past the Houses of Parliament towards Lambeth Bridge and on to the Tate Gallery. It is said that 40 to 50,000 people were able to pass the coffin of that man that evening and that afternoon before midnight on the 11th of November, 1920. They could all tell you stories of the reasons why they were there, and I have selected just one. A mother came down from Inverness. She had never been to Edinburgh in her life. She had never been out of Scotland. She had never been in England. She had not been to London. But by her small home in Inverness was a little garden planted by her son before he went to war in France. And she had taken from that garden a few white droplets and flowers, which she'd carefully brought down to London, and which she was allowed to place by the grave of the man whom she now believed to be her son. And of course, so many others fulfilled similar acts of thanks and gratitude and belief. And in that week, the doors of the Abbey remained open until the 18th of November. It is thought that 1.25 million people made that journey behind the open grave with its closed coffin beneath them. And at the end of the week, a stone made of York stone with some simple wording was placed on top of the grave, and it was sealed. And the wording reads or read, "A British warrior who fell in the Great War 1914 to 1918 for king and country. Greater love have no man than this." And so the unknown warrior had been laid to rest. But in front of his grave was put the Padre's flag, David Railton's flag. This was a grave upon which no one was to stand. No one stood either on the flag, and it remained there for a year. For there is another short story to tell you before we come to the end of this talk. Armistice Day 1921 saw another very important gathering in Westminster Abbey. A few weeks earlier, General Pershing from America had come to the Abbey and given the unknown warrior the Congressional Medal of Honor. And in return, the American unknown warrior was given one of Britain's Victoria Crosses, the first and only time that a Victoria Cross has ever been given to anyone whose name is not known. But the purpose of the special service held on the 11th of November 1921 was to dedicate the grand stone that now appears on the surface of the nave, and which wording is long and valued. The stone came from a Belgian quarry at Nemours, which is made of black stone, and you will know the wording, but I will read it again to you now. Beneath this stone rests the body of a British warrior, unknown by name or rank, brought from France to lie among the most illustrious of the land, and buried here on Armistice Day 1920 in the presence of His Majesty King George V, his ministers of state, the chiefs of his forces, and a vast concourse of the nation. Thus are commemorated the many multitudes who during the Great War of 1914 to 1918 gave the most that man can give, life itself, for God, for king and country, for loved ones, home and empire, for the sacred cause of justice, and for the freedom of the world. And then there are 2 lines of extra words selected by the Dean of Westminster Abbey, the Right Reverend Herbert Ryle, and which he'd seen on a tomb of a Dean of Salisbury, buried in Westminster Abbey 500 years earlier in the reign of King Richard II. And those words read as follows: they buried him among the kings because he had done good towards God and towards his house. The story of the unknown warrior does not end there. It will, of course, never end. But I'd like to remind you that in 1923, our much-loved Queen Mother Elizabeth Bowes-Lyon, on her wedding day, when she came to the west doors and through the west doors of Westminster Abbey, the first thing that she did was to place her wedding bouquet on this tomb. For she remembered her brother Fergus, who'd gone and died in France, whose body was never recovered. And no doubt she was thinking, as thousands and thousands and millions of others have thought, that Fergus, with others, could have been the man who is buried there. And of course, a few days ago, we saw Queen Elizabeth II go on her own, accompanied only by a lieutenant colonel bearing her wreath, place her wreath on the grave of the unknown warrior. And there it will rest for a while, surrounded by those poppy leaves, and the grave will surely remain in the Westminster Abbey, for the whole of that abbey's remaining history, whether it be short or long, but may be for centuries and centuries to come. So that is the story that I tell you exactly 100 years on the very evening of the 11th of November, 1920, when so much of London was plunged into emotion and hope and faith and belief.
Well, thank you so much, Judge Bradbury. That was incredibly moving. Earlier on, it was like a thriller, kind of waiting for it to happen. And thanks to Lloyd George and Sir Henry Wilson and so on. We have some questions, which I gather you've been kind enough to say you will do your best to respond to. And the first person with a question is Janet Berridge.
Thank you very much, Rupert. And thank you, Judge Bradbury, for a very, very interesting talk. While you were telling the story of bringing the body back, I lived in Canterbury for 18 years, and I could imagine it arriving at Dover and going through Faversham. I travelled that route so often. And I'm also very proud of the fact that at the National Liberal Club, as an adjunct to our literary circle in 2011, I started a series of poetry readings on Remembrance Day or the nearest Wednesday to it. And we continued with that until at least 2018 in order to reflect on remembrance in a general sense, but especially about the two world wars. And it's a very, very poignant story, and I've never heard that much detail. Thank you so much. I was going to ask you if it was absolutely sure that it was a British soldier, but you did say British warrior. So there's no doubt it couldn't have been a Commonwealth soldier?
No, it wasn't a Commonwealth soldier. The verbal instructions that were passed down from the War Office were that when these small exhumation parties reached the battlefields and started the difficult task of unearthing bodies of men for whom there were markers that they were unknown, save known as to God, that they had to find some shreds of British Army uniform on the body, but not sufficient shreds to be able to identify them by unit or regiment, let alone by name. And so one can be satisfied that they were British Army bodies, but they could have been naval bodies. I say British Army bodies, I should have said British uniforms. The unknown warrior could have been a naval man because the Royal Naval Division sent 40,000 men to fight in France and Flanders during the Great War. And there is, of course, the remote possibility that it could have been an airman shot down over France, but certainly British. And that's why it was such a British ceremony. And that other countries, including Australia and New Zealand, later had their own cemeteries and services in their own country to mark their unknown warriors.
Thank you very much.
And our next question comes from Chris Hallworth. Chris.
Thank you very much. That was very interesting. And my question is actually about those unknown warriors of other countries. And I wonder if you could say anything about, I've often wondered, how does our warrior sit chronologically and metaphorically amongst those others? So was ours first? And also it struck me, particularly in European countries that I have been to that have these tombs of unknown warriors, they are often in very grand settings, but in sort of a splendid isolation, entirely alone. And you've pointed out the most illustrious of the land comment. Is the point of ours rather different, that Westminster Abbey is meant to be literally buried amongst kings, and perhaps have other European nations taken a different approach to that view?
We were joint equal if one's looking for chronological bearings, because the French government had the idea in 1919 of selecting an unknown warrior from the battlefields around Verdun and burying him in the Pantheon in Paris. But their idea was not taken forward in 1919 and was only revived when they heard of the British intention to bury an unknown warrior in Westminster Abbey. So that at 11 o'clock in Paris on the 11th of November 1920, a French unknown warrior was buried. And I'm rather assuming that the timescales for Britain and France were then identical, so that the two 11 a.m.s were indeed at the same time. The French unknown warrior was not buried in the Pantheon. He's buried under the Arc de Triomphe. And he was selected from 9 bodies that were taken from the battlefield at Verdun. And the other 8 bodies there were buried in a circle in the Grand Cemetery in the heart of Verdun. And so those remaining 8 bodies are known about. Now, other countries followed suit. America and Italy in 1922. Germany, I think, about 19 30, but they had buried many bodies in mass graves. They didn't have the same view about burial and the importance of individual sites as in Britain, but they did select an unknown warrior in 1930, and Australia, New Zealand and Canada have all done so in more recent years. For Australia and New Zealand, it was sufficient and easy for them to find a body on the battlefields of Gallipoli. And of course, Canada took place in some of the great battles of the First World War, not least at Vimy Ridge, and their body may have come from there. Now, as to your second question, it was indeed deliberate, as the stone on the body of the warrior suggests now. This man should rest among the kings and the great statesmen of Britain and others who had given distinguished service. He was indeed an equal, just as equal as any of them were equal to each other. And it's true that there are other places in other cemeteries throughout the world where you'll find individual bodies buried in selected places, very isolated and very moving. I once went to a cemetery in Malaysia and found by chance the grave of an airman who'd won the Victoria Cross. The cemetery was so isolated that I don't think anyone else had visited it in the year I went. Isolation, as well as great multitudes, an enormous difference to belief and to grief.
Thank you.
Thank you. So one more question. I think because we're looking forward to hearing from Colonel Claire Waterworth in response to Judge Bradbury. One more question, and that comes from Marshall Kent.
Good evening. Thank you very much, Judge Bradbury, for your most interesting talk. My question has somewhat been answered by the previous responses by Chris Hallworth, in that were we the first nation to have a tomb of an unknown soldier? So perhaps I can ask a subsequent question around how do you think the tomb of the unknown soldier represents the unknown warriors from other generations, perhaps the Second World War?
Well, it's difficult, of course, to say that anyone who lost a loved one during the Second World War might believe that that loved one lies in the grave in Westminster Abbey. That cannot be so. And that perhaps now represents the value of the cenotaph, because the cenotaph does reflect a place where people can go wherever their loved one was lost, and it represents those who were lost in all wars. I do sometimes reflect, having been quite a long time ago now, to stand by the cenotaph in the crowds on Armistice Day, but whilst there are thousands there, there may be nobody standing at the same time by the tomb of the unknown warrior in Westminster Abbey. So I think both the tomb and the cenotaph are now very important symbols in British history and life. And it's good that we have both of them, the one remembering the worst war of all, but the other remembering those who died in other wars, wherever they may be throughout the world. Now, before I finish speaking, I was given an agenda in which I was asked to propose the toast of the National Liberal Club. So before there is a response, perhaps I may now, Mr. Chairman, propose that toast. And I can do so on two grounds, really. One, that I've had the pleasure of visiting not very often, but visiting occasionally your club, often as a member of the Trollope Society. The Victorian novelist Anthony Trollope, of course, loved writing political novels in which battles were fought in a fictional House of Commons between Liberal prime ministers and potential Conservative prime ministers, or between Conservative prime ministers and potential Liberal Prime Ministers. And the Trollope Society are glad to come to your club for their meetings because Anthony Trollope stood unsuccessfully, as Charles Welchman has said a number of us have done, in a general election, in his case in Beverley in Yorkshire, where he was defeated by the two Conservative candidates, and took the same view of them as a certain person might be doing of his opponent in the United States at this moment. But I mustn't, of course, in any way be political. But the second reason for being glad to propose this vote of thanks is because of David Lloyd George. I have mentioned four men: David Railton, Herbert Ryle, Field Marshal Sir Henry Wilson, and David Lloyd George. But no one of them on his own could have attained this burial in the Abbey. And it was David Lloyd George who, through his determination and skill, obtained from the King really a little act of surrender, the King surrendering to parliamentary democracy and allowing the body to be buried. So to come, as I'd hoped to speak to you in the club, would have been wonderful, but to be able to speak to members of the club without being there is equally wonderful. And so I'm very glad now to raise a glass and to invite any of you who may have glasses with you to drink the toast of the National Liberal Club.
The club.
Thank you again.
To the club. Thank you.
To the club.
Yeah.
Now I'm going to call upon our NLC member, Colonel Claire Waterworth, MBE, to respond on behalf of the club.
Thank you, Rupert. Can everyone hear me all right?
Yes, very much so.
Good, excellent. So as a member of the armed forces and a member of the Liberal Club, I would like to thank His Honour for a thought-provoking and informative talk on the unknown warrior. I think that this was organised and executed brilliantly through Zoom. And I think we would all agree that you painted a vivid and very moving picture of the journey of the unknown warrior. So thank you very much for that. I think that for those of us who serve or have served in the military, we each have our own experiences of conflict. And we can only guess at the experiences of others and how these experiences affect them and those around them. However, we are all shaped by the idea that at any time during our service, we could be called upon to carry out our duty, and that this might require us to make the ultimate sacrifice. Again, we know what drives our own sense of duty, but we can only guess at what drives it in others and how it drives them. Whatever it is, that sense of duty is a powerful thing. Whether we're born with it or whether we acquire it, it is notable that it exists in some of the very youngest of our men and women who in today's climate choose to pursue this job, unlike our forebears who did not have the luxury of that choice. And for those of us who have deployed on operations alongside soldiers, sailors, airmen and women, we have witnessed firsthand the brilliance, the bravery, the humour of those volunteers who choose to serve. But we've also witnessed the loss, the pain and the sacrifice of those who are left behind when a comrade dies. And we've also watched them turn selflessly to the right and get on with the job they know they must do. As a soldier, it is very important that the nation that we came from and will go back to realises this sacrifice. No one can really know what another person is going through. The injured, the comrades, the families. These things go on a long way away in dark, unfamiliar places, far from the comfort and familiarity of home and everything we hold dear. It is hard for us to imagine what conditions must have been like on the battlefields of wars long past. But even with sophisticated media, it is just as hard for people to truly imagine the battlefields of today. For that reason, there has to be a focal point for a nation, something that we can relate to, something we can all turn to. And I think you set this out very, very clearly. The Unknown Warrior is this focal point at its simplest and at its most raw. The idea that the unknown soldier transcends war, time, politics is so important. He represents all those who have given the ultimate sacrifice. And this gives comfort to all those who may have to give their lives for their country. I'm a very visual person. I need to conjure up images of what I'm saying. And I have this picture, a vision, if you like, of all the emotion of a nation pouring through the conduit of the Unknown Warrior to all those who have died, wherever they have died and however they have died. It's important for the living to know and to take comfort in this outpouring of gratitude and grief. All of us who serve take great comfort in this. So on behalf of the Liberal Club and on behalf of the Armed Forces, I'd like to thank you for such an excellent and informative speech, which I found extremely moving, and I'm sure others did as well. So thank you very much. And I look forward to, well, not having a drink with you necessarily, but perhaps having a chat on another occasion about your speech. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you very much, Claire, if I may, Colonel Claire, Judge Bradbury. Thank you both. That was fantastic. You know, the Liberal Club, we have so many strands of opinion, and you know, a pacifist would be listened to with great respect, and a lot of us kind of wonder about the reasons for wars. You know, the reason for the Second World War seems to many of us so much clearer than for the first. But the point isn't that, it's that the sacrifice is the same, the grief is the same. And I think you brought that out, Judge Bradbury, so well. And Claire, you made the point that we can't, people have different sort of senses of duty. Some people perhaps don't have a sense of duty, but we don't know what's going on in someone else's mind. And it's not for us to question the motives of people who are serving in the armed forces. What we do, what unites us all, regardless of our views of whether a war was a good thing or whether we were on the right side or any of that, is that people did what they thought was right. They stood in harm's way. They made that ultimate sacrifice. And the grief is the same. And I thought you brought that out so well. I mean, I had to reach for the tissues. The mother from Inverness did it for me. But that's something that unites us all, is just respect for the value of human life and of the, what can I say, the sort of purgative effect of grief. It unites us all. So I think your talks, both of you, thank you so much, have united us all. And so on behalf of the club, thank you very, very much. We can get on now with the rest of our lives. Thank goodness we're here to celebrate.